Hello everyone and welcome to another Cut Rate Commander Precon Upgrade Guide, the series where we take a look at Precon decks and bring them up to cut rate standards. My name is Grazzet, and today we'll be looking at the Eldrazi Unbound Precon from Commander Masters and its face commander, Zhulodok Void Gorger, which, due to the increased price of the deck, will be bringing up from its roughly $85 price point to an increased budget of $135 after upgrades. But before we continue, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe if you like this content and would like me to continue making more videos like this in the future. And if you're feeling particularly generous, please consider buying me a coffee at the link in the description to keep me caffeinated as I work on more of these builds, or instead use our newly acquired affiliate link with Game Nerds in the description below if you're looking to purchase sealed MTG product for Commander Masters or any of the other sets that they offer for some of the lowest prices around, all while helping out the channel as you do so. Also, be sure to stick around until the end of the video to see which commanders we'll be covering in the next few weeks. So, with that out of the way, let's start by taking a look at the commander and playstyle. Zhulodok Void Gorger is a 7/4 Eldrazi that costs 5 and colorless that has the following ability. Colorless spells we cast from our hand of CMC 7+ have Cascade. Breaking down its core stats, Zhulodok is sporting a hefty CMC, a high power low toughness stat spread for its cost, and an ability that incentivizes us to hardcast high CMC spells in order to generate a potentially huge amount of value from our deck. Despite this ability being limited to CMC 7+ spells, being able to turn a single CMC 7 spell into 3 spells with a combined CMC ceiling of 19 is a huge swing for us, almost making Zhulodok a kill-on-sight commander due to the sheer amount of value it can dump on the table for us turn after turn, which again only gets better as we cast bigger and bigger spells. So, as we can see based on their ability, Zhulodok is clearly a big mana commander, wanting us to cast big CMC 7+ spells so we can generate additional value from our deck via Cascade. And the base build does a decent job at supporting that game plan by providing us with a good number of both new and old high CMC creatures for us to build up our board state with, various high-cost non-creature spells to help pad out the base build's core stats despite us being only limited to colorless spells, and capping off with a respectable ramp package to help mitigate bricking due to the high cost of our spells. But as usual, there's always room for improvement. This time around, however, keeping the budget at exactly $50 was a bit tricky, considering the price of a lot of the cards in this upgrade guide have been fluctuating wildly. So, in an effort to still release this guide in a timely manner, the prices I'll be using for the upgrades will be the ones that they were about a week ago, though be aware that these prices may have changed between now and then and more than likely have gone up, so I do apologize for any inconsistencies. So with that covered and going back to our upgrades, this deck does seem to have a non-bow element built into it in the form of X spells, which in theory can be useful to proc our commander's Cascade by pumping enough mana into them, but are absolutely terrible to Cascade into since if we do, they're considered CMC 0. So we'll just be replacing them with more naturally high CMC entrants that can still trigger our Cascade while still being viable Cascade targets themselves to improve the build's consistency. And then with our big spells covered, which to be fair will be taking up quite a bit of our budget, we'll be using what remains to make some quality of life changes to the build via adding in even more ramp to the build to improve its speed even further, as well as a handful of sub-CMC 7 additions to improve our core stats and colorless game plan, thereby ensuring that Zhulodok has all the resources and support necessary to consume all those who stand against it and its brood. So let us turn back the sands of time on Zendikar, to a time when the madness of the Eldrazi imprisoned on the plane infected its populace and drove them to weaken their prisons. Not enough to free the Titans themselves, but enough for their spawn to spill forth onto the plane. It was here that Zhulodok came forth, a powerful spawn of Ulamog, and as it materialized into our reality, it took notice of the horrified cultists that had freed them from their prison, and, whether intentional or by happenstance, it bestowed upon them the gift of his sire's endless hunger, creating the vampire race on Zendikar to serve as slaves for his master. And while Zhulodok was destroyed millennia ago, the strain of vampirism it left on the plane can still be felt to this day. Yet another legacy left on Zendikar by the unknowable abominations known as the Eldrazi. So, now that we have a better understanding of the commander and playstyle, let's take a look at the cards we'll be keeping from the base build. Beginning with the creatures that made the cut from the core build, we'll start off with some mana generating entries that help make casting our CMC 7+ spells much more reasonable. As such, we'll be holding on to Ornithopter of Paradise and Palladium Mirror as a decent pair of mana dorks that help speed up our colorless mana base. Burnished Heart will be staying in as a solid piece of land-based ramp, which is a rarity in colorless that helps us get the wastes in our deck into play. Solemn Simulacrum also stays in as another land ramp source when it ETBs that also cantrips on death to help us dig for more resources. Oblivion Sower hangs on to its spot as a decent-sized body that has a good chance of stealing one or more lands off our opponent's decks. And Matter Reshaper hangs on to its spot as well thanks to the on-death potential land ramp it provides, or, at worst, serving as a cantrip to replace itself instead. Then moving on from our mana-generating creatures and onto the CMC 7+ creatures we're going to be casting with that mana. Bane of Balaged, Artisan of Kozilek, and It That Betrays will all be staying in thanks to the powerful Annihilator and Pseudo-Annihilator removal they bring to the table with every attack they make, with the first exiling the sacked permanents to make recurring them next to impossible, the second providing some decent reanimation for us if we hardcast it, and the last possessing a backbreaking passive that reanimates anything sacked by our opponents under our control, as will the new Flayer of Loyalties, which is yet another huge Eldrazi with Annihilator that this time lets us use it immediately thanks to temporarily stealing an opponent's creature and turning it into a hasty pseudo-copy of itself to swing in with on the turn it comes down. And while on the topic of gigantic Eldrazi, Kozilek the Great Distortion will of course be hanging on to its spot as well, being a fantastic reprint that not only reloads our hands as it comes down, but then also lets us use those cards as manaless spell disruption to make it even more difficult for our opponents to deal with our massive creatures, and that's on top of being a 12/12 pseudo-evasive beatstick to boot. And then to round out our CMC 7+ behemoths, we'll be retaining the artifact creature's Meteor Golem as a decent if expensive source of permanent destruction that's more palatable once we cascade twice off it, Phyrexian Triniform as another big beatstick that leaves behind 9/9 worth of stats on death, on top of taking advantage of our massive ramp package to encore itself back for one last swing and even more tokens, and Ancient Stone Idol as one of our biggest trampling beaters that we can play at flash speed to cascade on our opponent's turns, that also leaves behind a decent-sized body if our opponents are able to get rid of it on top of that. And finally, wrapping up our kept creature base, Endbringer will be staying in as, at best, a way for us to draw an extra card on each player's turn thanks to the aforementioned gigantic ramp package we have, or, at worst, providing us with either free pings or cheap attack or block prevention instead. Obtruse Archaic will be keeping its spot as a cheap way for us to copy any of our creatures' abilities, including the cascade our commander grants them when cast for additional value. Skittering Cicada will be retaining its position as both a means for us to cast our colorless spells at flash speed to dodge removal and wipes, as well as a powerful colorless payoff that can make itself into a massive trampling threat as we cast our colorless spells. And lastly, Crashing Drawbridge will round out our kept creature base by giving our massive creatures haste when they come down so they can immediately put their massive stat blocks to use, and proc any on-attack triggers they may have before our opponents are able to mount a proper defense. Then proceeding to our kept instance, it's going to be removal all the way down. Beginning with the cheaper entrance, Warping Whale, which if in hand will usually be using to counter sorcery speed wipes, but if we cascade into we can still use to deal with low power or toughness creatures or to generate colorless ramp we can use later. And Titan's Presence, which takes advantage of our high volume of huge creatures to exile all but the biggest threats for only 3 mana. And then as our CMC 7 Plus entrance in this category, as well as our last two instants, we have Desecrate Reality and Not of This World. The former allowing us to remove the biggest threats on each of our opponent's boards when cast, on top of reanimating one of our threats if we don't cascade into it to further build up our board, and the latter being essentially a free counterspell against anything that targets our commander or other huge creatures, which is admittedly terrible to cascade into, but is still worth running as a powerful mana-less source of protection, and a free cascade that triggers on our opponent's turns. Then reaching our held over sorceries, this entire category will remain unchanged from the base build, with both Board Wipes Calamity of the Titans and All Is Dust staying in as means for us to retake control of the board that either take advantage of our high CMC creatures or our colorless color identity respectively, and Rise of the Eldrazi staying in as well as a gigantic spell that does a bit of everything for us by providing exile-based removal, card advantage, and an extra turn. Its first two abilities being nice, and the last of which should position us to win the game or at least eliminate an opponent or two if we have an established board state. We'll then skip over the enchantment category, since we won't be keeping any from the core build, and jump right into our kept artifacts, which will start off with the base build's Mana Rock collection that we'll be holding on to in order to help take the edge off casting our higher CMC spells. For example, we'll be holding on to Soul Ring, Mind Stone, Thought Vessel, and Worn Power Stone as relatively cheap colorless rocks to help build up our mana base in the early game with occasional upside. Thran Dynamo will stay in thanks to being a superb reprint and colorless source of mana for its cost in the mid game or if we ramp into it. Hedron Archive and Dreamstone Hedron will keep their spots as even more passable colorless ramp that can double up as card draw once we don't need their ramp anymore. And Everflowing Chalice will retain its position despite being a pseudo-X spell, since we can still pay its multi-kicker cost if we cascade into it, preventing it from being a dead cascade hit while also making it a decent scalable mana rock when we hardcast it. Forsaken Monument will then also be staying in this category, as it allows our colorless lands and rocks to tap for an additional mana to greatly speed up our mana base, and that's on top of being a powerful colorless anthem to empower our creatures and a source of continual life gain to pad our life totals. Then with our mana generating artifacts covered, we'll move on to our cheaper retained artifacts, where we'll be holding on to Lightning Greaves as yet another solid reprint that helps protect our commander from the targeted removal that will undoubtedly be coming its way, while also giving it or any of our other massive creatures haste to swing in immediately as they come down, all at no equip cost. Mirage Mirror will be staying in as a way for us to cheaply double up on our enormous permanents and get additional damage and or value out of them turn after turn. And Mystic Forge will retain its spot as well thanks to the colorless future sight it provides us with, allowing us to cast the majority of our spells off the top of our deck, while simultaneously allowing us to clear dead cards off the top of our deck if necessary. And then reaching our kept CMC 7 Plus artifacts, and the last artifacts we'll be holding on to, Kaldra Complete makes the grade as a resilient threat on its own that we can then equip to our commander or any of our other gigantic creatures to not only protect them, but to also make them even bigger and more dangerous thanks to the keywords it grants them. And the new Darksteel Monolith carries over thanks to its ability allowing us to cast a free spell per turn to speed up our tempo considerably, which we can still cascade off of despite paying 0 since this effect doesn't change the spell's CMC. Then moving on to the Lone Planeswalker entrant that made the grade, we have Ugin the Ineffable, who of course will retain his position thanks to his passive cost reduction, shaving off a solid amount of mana from all our spells, while his repeatable card advantage and targeted removal are also very useful in order for us to further improve the final build's core stats. And finally, reaching our retained land base, we'll of course be holding on to the majority of the colorless generating utility lands included in the base build to both tap for our color, or lack thereof, while also providing us with additional upside. So, starting with our core stat improving lands, Arch of Araska, Bonder's Enclave, Seagate Wreckage, and War Room will all be holding on to their spots as relatively easy-to-use sources of repeatable card advantage from our land slot. Blast Zone stays in thanks to providing scalable and potentially AoE removal if needed, and Eldrazi Temple and Shrine of the Forsaken Gods will both be retaining their spots as ramp sources, as they can each situationally tap for more than 1 mana via synergizing with our Eldrazi and or ramp-heavy game plans respectively. And while on the topic of tapping for more mana, we'll of course be hanging on to Urza's Mine, Urza's Power Plant, and Urza's Tower as lands that individually tap for colorless that, when combined, can proceed to tap for a huge amount of mana, which may not happen often but is amazing if we manage to pull it off, so there's no reason not to run them, as well as the Bounce Land Gilded Commons and the Storage Land Majoring Network, whose abilities to either naturally tap for 2 mana or to allow us to stockpile up on mana allow us to keep our mana base consistent even if we do end up missing a few of our land drops. And then moving on to the remainder of our retained colorless utility lands, Arcane Lighthouse will keep its spot as a decent way for us to strip away our opponent's creatures of very common targeting protection to make them easier to deal with. Mirror Pool retains its position as a means for us to get a second copy of any of our high CMC creatures and or spells for even more board presence and or value. Reliquary Tower makes the cut as a decent way for us to ensure our repeatable draw sources don't overdraw us. Scavenger Grounds will remain as a solid source of AoE graveyard hate. Forge of Heroes, Rogue's Passage, and Tyrite Sanctum will all be staying in as ways to either grow our commander as we cast and recast them, to ensure that they or any of our other high CMC creatures can reliably get in for damage, or to protect them from removal to ensure we can continue to benefit from their effect. Gyre Reach Sanitarium holds on to its position thanks to its repeatable card selection helping us smooth out our draws to ensure we can hit our land drops and ramp sources, which is invaluable in the early game due to our very high mana curve. And Tomb of the Spirit Dragon will be staying in as well thanks to being an on-theme source of repeatable life gain that we can use to pad our life totals as we cascade into more and more colorless permanents. And lastly, we'll be keeping the 15 wastes included in the base build as much appreciated reprints to round out our mana base. That leaves us with a final tally of 77 cards, including basic lands we'll be keeping from the base build, leaving us with 23 cards to replace, making this the smallest amount of new additions we'll be adding to any of these precons, but giving us more of a budget to spend on individual cards as a result. So, now that we've covered all the cards that made the cut from the core build, let's move on to our upgrades. Leading off with our new creature additions, we'll begin by cutting the less than reliable X-cost creatures included in the base build and replacing them with some naturally high CMC Eldrazi, which can still proc our commander while still being viable targets to cascade into. As such, we'll be cutting Endless One, Hangerback Walker, Stonecoil Serpent, and Omarthus Ghostfire Initiate, which again are theoretically good to proc our Cascade if we cast them from hand with enough mana, but are terrible cards to cascade into due to coming in as CMC 0 spells, in favor of Desolation Twin, Breaker of Armies, Ulamog's Crusher, and Pathrazer of Ulamog, all of which can still reliably proc our commander, and, unlike their predecessors, are fantastic spells to cascade into thanks to the additional board presence, pseudo-evasion granting, and repeatable removal via Annihilator they provide. We'll then be replacing some of our decent, but sadly too cheap artifact creatures with even more high CMC Eldrazi to proc our commander even more, with Soul of New Phyrexia's bit too expensive protection being exchanged out for Deceiver of Form, which allows us to turn our entire board into huge creatures off the top of our deck to enable devastating alpha strikes, and the very decent repeatable removal that Steel Hellkite provides being scrapped so we can add in the newly reprinted Ulamog the Ceaseless Hunger, which not only is a fantastic addition for lore reasons, but also provides more immediate removal than its precursor, a massive resilient body, and a timer that's guaranteed to close out games in, at most, 5 turns via mill so long as we can swing in. We'll then switch gears from adding in big mana Eldrazi, mostly due to budget constraints keeping them out of reach without breaking the bank, to adding in additional high CMC artifact creatures to extract even more value out of Zhulodok. So we'll be cutting the more or less vanilla beatstick in this build, Metalwork Colossus, in favor of Triplicate Titan, who's only slightly smaller and whose powerful keywords and on-death token creation are much more valuable to us. Axing the interesting but awkward to proc token creation Myriad Construct brings to the table in order to make room for Maelstrom Colossus, who alongside our commander lets us cascade 3 times when cast to generate us even more value, and swapping out Duplicant's serviceable targeted removal to swap in Sandstone Oracle in its place, whose ability to reload our hands on ETB is invaluable to ensure we don't run out of high CMC spells to continue cascading with. And then to close out our new creature additions, we'll be adding in a handful of smaller CMC creatures that help support our big mana colorless game plan, with the awkward to use land ramp source Scare Tiller losing its spot to Zenith Chronicler, who comes down much earlier and takes advantage of our lack of colored spells to generate us card advantage while our opponents cast their multicolored spells, the useful but too situational commander casting Geode Golem being replaced with Mannequin, which we can use as a cheap mana dork to further speed up our game plan without having to get in for damage like its predecessor, the evasion granting Suspicious Bookcase losing its spot to Conduit of Ruin, which not only provides even more cost reduction for our high CMC creatures, but also lets us tutor for any of those creatures to improve the build's consistency, the indiscriminate board wipe Perilous Vault being shelved in favor of Wandering Archaic, who either slows down our opponents by taxing their spells or getting us copies of those spells for ourselves, either of which are beneficial for us, and the subpar removal provided by Transmogrifying Wand being smelted down to make room for Liberator Urza's Battlethopter, which gives us another way to cast most of our deck at flash speed, this time on an evasive body that permanently grows itself as we cast our high CMC spells. Then reaching our instant upgrades, the only change we'll be making here will be removing Ugin's Mastery, which in theory is a good way to cheat high CMC creatures into play, but more often than not hits lands and non-creatures that will then never have the opportunity to play, to add in Scour from Existence, which is admittedly a very expensive piece of removal, but the fact that Zhulodok lets us cascade off it twice on our opponent's turns helps take the edge off while bolstering our removal package. Then skipping all the way down to our new artifact upgrades, we'll again be focusing on adding in more ways to support our big mana game plan, with the mediocre mana rock Unstable Obelisk, the decent but unnecessary equipment Fire Shrieker, and the middling combat trick Spatial Contortion being shelved for Basalt Monolith, Stone Speaker Crystal, and Soul Talisman, all of which add even more colorless ramp to the build, thus ensuring we can reliably get to our CMC 6 commander and our CMC 7 plus spells even more reliably, with the last one functionally being an extra soul ring if we cascade into it, the bit too slow and finite draw source Investigator's Journal being slotted out so we can slot in Wayfarer's Bauble, which serves as yet another source of cheap ramp to help us speed up our mana base even further, the other subpar draw source Maze Mind Tome losing its spot to Mind's Eye, which is a much more potent source of card advantage in this build that takes advantage of our huge ramp package to draw us at least 3 extra cards per rotation, the other repeatable draw source Endless Atlas being sidelined to make room for Expedition Map, which helps ensure we can make our land drops and lets us fetch up any utility land we may need, making it particularly good when we're trying to assemble our Tron lands, and the OK colorless payoff Ruins of Oran Reef will be raised again to make space for Swiftfoot Boots, giving us a bit more protection to help keep Zhulodok alive against the inevitable slew of removal that's bound to be coming its way. And at last, reaching our land upgrades, the lone change we'll be making here will be terraforming the still bad Temple of the False God into the tutor Sanctum of Ugin, which we can very easily proc in this build to tutor up a high CMC creature right to hand to ensure we have another spell to trigger our commander on subsequent turns, or even that turn if we have enough mana to cast it. So, now that we've covered all 23 cards that we've upgraded from the core build, let's take a look at the breakdown for this Precon upgrade. This deck currently has 32 creatures including our commander, 6 instants, 3 sorceries, 0 enchantments, 21 artifacts, 1 planeswalker, and 37 lands. Looking at the stats that matter to our game plan, we have 63 colorless spells, 24 cards that are CMC 7+, 8 cards that care about colorless spells, 3 cards that care about CMC 7+ spells, and 4 cards that can protect our commander from targeting or removal, leaving us with a very simple looking game plan that's nonetheless very effective due to the sheer amount of value our commander can generate for us via turning nearly a quarter of our deck into 3 spells for the price of 1, while also generating us additional value through our colorless and big mana payoffs as we keep our commander alive. Then for general deck stats, we have 26 ramp sources, 14 card draw sources, 16 targeted removal sources, and 3 board wipes. Our ramp being off the charts in this build in an effort to reliably cast our high CMC commander and spells without bricking, while our removal is high as well due to a lot of our big creatures having removal built into their kit via Annihilator or other abilities. Looking at our mana curve, we have 2 0 drops, 3 1 drops, 9 2 drops, 9 3 drops, 6 4 drops, 3 5 drops, 7 6 drops, 9 7 drops, 4 8 drops, 3 9 drops, 5 10 drops, 1 11 drop, and 2 12 drops, leaving us with a super heavyweight curve that, despite its multiple dips and spikes, still works incredibly well alongside our commander, aiming to ramp hard in the early game, getting Zhulodok into play as quickly as possible, and then keeping him alive so he can generate us an insane amount of value with each subsequent high CMC spell we cast, until our opponents are crushed under the onslaught of value we keep cascading out of our deck. The final price of this build then comes out to be $135.36 after upgrades. This price does not include tax or shipping and assumes that the price you paid for the Precon was $85. The price of the cards was calculated using the cheapest listed marketplace price on TCG Player at the time of this recording. Then skipping our usual side grade suggestions, since there aren't really any I can think of to recommend that aren't in the base build already, we'll be jumping right into further upgrades, where we can break the bank by replacing Forge of Heroes with Eye of Ugin, which effectively taps for 2 mana for our commander and the majority of our creature base, while also serving as a repeatable tutor for our creatures as well. Cutting Triplicate Titan for Void Winnower as a superbly annoying card to drop on the table and prevent our opponents from casting half of their decks with its mere presence, and axing Desolation Twin and Sandstone Oracle to summon forth the Eldrazi Titans, Ulamog the Infinite Gyre, and Kozilek Butcher of Truth, both of which fit in this build perfectly with their on-cast removal and draw, on-attack Annihilator, and imposing stat blocks. Though do keep in mind that these 4 cards will tack on another $100+ to this build's final price, so you'll need to decide whether or not it's worth it to survive off instant noodles for a while in order to add these to your build. Thanks everyone for sticking around until the end of the video. So, now that we've covered all the Precon upgrades for Commander Masters, we can finally get back to working on the backlog of Commander builds I've been putting off since I've gotten back from break, which will start off with a Quintorius Loremaster Planeswalker Reanimator build next week, and we'll be following up with 2 builds featuring commanders from the Lords of the Ring set, namely Saruman the White Hand and Tom Bombadil, so look forward to those coming soon. And lastly, before we close out, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe if you haven't done so already, as this channel can't continue to grow without your support. And if you're feeling particularly generous, feel free to keep me caffeinated via buying me a coffee at the link in the description, or alternatively, use our Game Nerds affiliate link in the description if you're looking to purchase sealed MTG product, accessories, board games, or any of their other wide selection of products at low prices that include free shipping for orders over $75, and a rewards program that builds up store credit over time as you make your purchases. And if any of you would like to support the channel in a different way, feel free to check out the other deck techs floating around my head if you'd like to see the latest builds, or click on the link above for a playlist of all the Cut Rate Commander episodes I've made so far. And with that, have a good one folks, and stay safe.